Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in today. I'm Nicole Forbes with Dennis's 7Ds, and today I'd like to talk to you about landscaping with native plants and creating habitat with those native plants in your own garden. So today here at the Lake Oswego Garden Center, as I usually do before class, I was able to push a couple of shopping carts around and gather up a representation of the kind of garden center's collection of native plants. Just really though, at any one moment in time, it's just like that. It's a moment in time of what we have today in our native plant department. And in most cases, throughout the season, the availability of specifically native plants, as well as really any other plant category in a garden center, really ebbs and flows, or the the variety of plants that are available change throughout the season. Some of our absolute favorite native plants we don't have with us today simply because either they are not available at the moment through the growers, or possibly they're not at a stage in their development where they're particularly popular, post bloom, that kind of thing. So when we are looking at and talking about native plants, there are a lot of resources for us to turn to. I mean, of course, there's taking a walk in nature, taking a walk in the woods, whether that's coastal environment or going out into the gorge, or perhaps out into eastern Oregon or southern Oregon. Walking around in all of these different environments outdoors shows us that depending on the kind of surrounding ecology, the weather, the available water, there are different plant communities that tend to grow in those natural areas. And if you pay enough attention over time, you begin to identify those plants that are often found grouped together. And that's really, again, because they have similar likes and or dislikes and grow in various climate conditions that meet their needs. So here in the Portland metro area, for example, we, even though we're in a metro area, have several different ecological zones or climate zones and habitats within our city limits and outside of the city limits. And so depending on whether you're in more of a woodland or forest type environment, possibly creekside in like a riparian situation, or if you're more in like proper Portland, which in my understanding is a former oak savanna type of a eco zone, the plants that we want to use need to be reflective of that available or kind of predominant factor, and that is, what are the conditions like? Tree cover, sun or shade, availability of water, type of soil. Is it mucky, wet, boggy soil? Is it hard, rocky clay? All of those conditions are going to kind of determine which plants want to live there and help you to kind of select that. Now, when we go to the various resources beyond what we can observe in nature, there are a lot of organizations that are here to help with us. And one of the best that we like to highlight is the Backyard Habitat Creation Program, or Backyard Habitat Certification Program, that's available here through the Portland metro area. And it's actually works with Multnomah, Clackamas, Washington, and Clark County in Washington state, and has over 5,000 citizen backyard certified habitats already in place, and many more in the works after several years of being a program in operation. So what they do is, for a small fee, you can coordinate with the Backyard Habitat Certification Program to have someone come to your home garden and do kind of an audit, assess which plants you have currently in your garden, determine with you if any of those plants would be considered a noxious weed or an invasive plant like English ivy is here in the Pacific Northwest. Help you to figure out how to eradicate and encourage you to eradicate the noxious weeds or invasive plants. And then also kind of see how much percent of your total landscape is composed of Pacific Northwest native plants. Now, it does not mean, just to be backyard certified, doesn't mean that you have to have 100% native plants. It doesn't mean you have to walk out your backyard and look at, you know, bare Oregon woods, for example. Nothing wrong with that, but not exactly everybody's idea of a tended landscape or a tended garden. So it is really just a certain percentage of your total landscape plants that are of native variety. Now, there beyond, of course, the backyard habitat certification program, there are wildlife certification programs and habitat programs through the National Wildlife Federation, and certainly wherever you are, most likely your state or county kind of planning department and or possibly soil and water conservation districts, which also work to encourage planting of native plants. Here in Portland, you can access the Portland plant list, which is a they don't even number their pages normal, so it's 3.14-4. I don't know how many pages this is, but it's a long, large document that is available as a download online. The Portland plant list, link to the Portland plant list and other information detailed by this class will be found as a blog attachment that will be right under the description of this video. So you'll find a link right there to see all the plants that we talk about, and then of course also to do things like access the Portland plant list, as well as backyard habitat and other links that you'll find on that blog. Now, this Portland plant list is a really helpful resource for, again, those of us that are locals in the Portland metro area, because it breaks down our native plants in detail based on the different communities that I was discussing. So community examples include prairie communities, deciduous forested wetlands and floodplains, herbaceous forbs, so that's kind of like a prairie style. There's grasses, there's woodland, for example. So whether it's a coniferous forest like a Douglas fir forest, or is it a deciduous tree forest like a big leaf maple, all of those are going to, again, be kind of different plant communities that are represented. And the backyard habitat certification uses this guide to determine which plants they really consider kind of to be primary native plants for your neighborhood or for your backyard. Now, in the larger kind of discussion of native plants and planting native plants, there are a few kind of fine lines to discuss and to consider. And what I mean by that is, what is a native plant? And the question of what makes a native plant a native plant. Now, I mean, there's some very easy answers to that, but then there's also some discussion around planting hybrids of native plants. So first off, what is a native plant to the Pacific Northwest? Well, the determination would be that any plant that was growing and abundant in, well, I guess it could be not abundant, but growing and physically present here in the Pacific Northwest before Europeans came to this area, those plants would be considered the plants native to the environment of the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, when Lewis and Clark came across and into Oregon for the first time and in the Oregon Territory, the plants that they saw would be considered native plants. Now, since those early days, native plants have been bred by plant breeders to either enhance flower color or bark or another feature to perhaps make them slightly more compact, or maybe a brighter, did I say brighter flower color? I probably did. So the breeders select things on plant characteristics to try to highlight and make them either more attractive to gardeners or even more appropriate to home gardens in general. And so a lot of the plants that I have on this table today, although many are considered true natives and are found on the Portland plant list, there are other cultivars of native plants that have been hybridized and were not here when Europeans first came to our area and settled the Oregon territories. So something such as the Pacific Fire vine maple, which is a lovely vine maple been bred specifically for, what do they say, beautiful creamy yellow and coral red stems, then this is a selected variety of vine maple that has been hybridized to have a brighter stem color and a more attractive winter feature. Now, the true native vine maple is this one here, so I can separate the two. Pacific Fire, and here is our true native vine maple, Acer circinatum. And the true vine maple would be the one that would be considered native on the Portland plant list versus the Pacific Fire. Now, the discussion over the appropriateness of one over another, that is where I think there's still some, there are some great studies being done and some research that really is kind of asking the question of, are native plants, a big reason for planting and gardening with native plants is to support our native wildlife and ecosystem. And so of course that goes from native pollinators, bees and other insects that are our native pollinators, all the way up to then native birds that either feed on the fruits or the parts of the plants themselves, the seeds, or they feed on the insects that are drawn to these plants, or up and up the food chain, creating again that kind of flora and fauna ecosystem of our native region. The question is whether or not the hybrids of these native plants provide the same attractiveness, the same cost benefits. So do they get the same payoff from visiting the flower or eating the fruit of a hybrid native plant versus a true native plant? There are lots of research programs being done on this very question right now, and some early conclusions are indicating that our native, especially native pollinators, are more attracted to specifically native plants over hybrid native plants. So again, the more, if we think about some of the things that we do to hybridize plants, the more complicated we make a flower, for example, the more difficult it is for our pollinators to get their job done. They've got to get into the business of the flower. So a big frilly double flower that we have bred to have more petals and kind of a more complex organization makes it more difficult for a pollinator to get in and access that, which then might lessen the chance that it gets pollinated at all, in which case it's not benefiting our native flora, or fauna. So that question, again, I'm going to leave hanging out there, and it's really one of those decisions that either you make for yourself when planting in your native landscape, or you're working with an organization such as the Backyard Habitat Certification, who has already sort of created their own guidelines, which really say the specific native plants and not the hybrids of native plants are what really are more, they're more interested in having planted. Now, the why landscape with natives, other than attracting and creating habitat, landscaping with native plants is also known to have fewer maintenance and gardening inputs from you, from the gardener. So they are, they have a reputation, native landscapes have a reputation of being low maintenance, but that's not always the case. Native plants may have fewer additional inputs, so you may not need to water it as much as you would an ornamental landscape through the summer months, but you will probably want to give it supplemental water, and especially a young native landscape, so something that's establishing roots still. Native plants are rumored to be pest and disease free, and that's not the case either. So native plants have their own issues, and some native plants will still be killed by insects, eaten by deer, mowed down by another, or crowded out by another plant in the landscape. So either you as the gardener need to kind of keep your plants protected from one another, keep an eye out on your native landscape, and of course spot any problems early on. But in most cases, the diseases that a lot of our native plants can get may have been brought here by the non-native plants that were, brought into our region long ago. So, such as our native flowering dogwood, the Cornus natalii, the Pacific dogwood, is now somewhat prone to the very same fungal diseases, anthracnose and a few other fungal diseases, as the more introduced and ornamental dogwood, the Cornus florida, because the Cornus florida came to our region and of course brought its diseases with it that our native dogwood has not necessarily been evolved to deal with. So this is how now we're, seeing an intersection of hybrid gardens, hybrid plants and ornamentals bringing their own issues that are potentially affecting our native plants as well. So it doesn't mean always that your native garden is going to be low maintenance or no maintenance, that it'll be disease and pest free. And when you walk out in the woods or, you are in nature, you do see, it's wild. So you see, some plants that are affected by issues and other plants that are not. And in many cases, that is nature, taking its course. That's some form of evolution or survival of the fittest. And the plants that are more adapted to their space are the ones that are going to naturally be able to flower, seed, and reproduce to become, again, more dominant in the landscape. So tips for designing with natives really means that we need to match our plants, as I keep kind of saying, match our plants with our space. And it's easy to create some year-round interest with natives because we have not only a range of evergreen coniferous plants, so we have little cedars and other evergreens, as well as plants that drop their leaves, flower early in the season, have maybe great fall color. So the range, again, through the seasons is available to have a multi-season interest with your native plants as well. It is also, a lot of our native plants are fairly large. So we need to think in layers in our landscape and using kind of deeper beds. A lot of times our landscape of a traditional kind of backyard or front yard is, postage stamp square. We have a fence or a privacy border around the edges, and then maybe a narrow planting bed, perhaps some elaborate shape that's a little bit more exciting in the corners, but usually planting beds are 4 feet deep, 6 feet at the most. I want to encourage you to have less lawn, of course, since that's not native. If we're talking about planting and landscaping with natives, carve away more space from your lawn to deepen those planting beds to allow you to put in taller plants towards the back fence line or property line and create those layers then of an upper story, a mid-story, and then a lower story of plants that are little ground covers and lovely kind of low growing perennials, such as I have towards the front of the table, and I'll talk about all of these when we get into the details of plants. Creating layers in your garden is not only a way to allow kind of that tiered look that gives you privacy and kind of lushness, um, allowing taller plants and smaller plants to kind of create that whole scene or network. But the layered effect of landscaping also is one that promotes and kind of creates a comfort zone for wildlife, and specifically birds. So songbirds will use the various tiers or stories in your garden to kind of make their approach and determine whether or not it's safe to kind of get down to the next level and then further down into the next level in your garden. So if there's no upper story for a songbird to kind of perch and make its primary assessment of A, whether or not there's anything worthy of its visit in your garden, and B, whether it is a safe place to go, it can observe those things from a high perch and then come in for a visit. So not only do you get that lush feel, but that encourages habitat creation. So designing in layers, and really also adding a mass of plants, at least in bigger groupings, will also help for pollinators or birds, for example, to locate and kind of mass feed on areas in your garden. So rather than alternating items for your landscape, having a group of one in one area will also look more natural. That's what nature would do, kind of spread out on its own, wouldn't do alternates and symmetry. But grouping your plants together also creates that landing zone for habitat for birds or pollinators to kind of zero in on. Now, specifically in Oregon, one of the primary components of our kind of natural areas in many ecological zones of the Pacific Northwest, there's water present. So whether that is a small stream, a lake, a creek, a pond, a river, an ocean, we have a lot of water here. And so habitat can also be kind of amplified, and the interest to bring in birds and insects is really kind of heightened by adding either a bird bath or a fountain or some source of water to your landscape as well. So just as you're creating that beautiful scene of native plants, consider a spot for a bird bath or a little fountain, which also just engages a whole nother sense where you can really hear the sound of water in your garden is very nice. Now, when we plant native plants, again, using the proper plant communities, there are less inputs to the planting process. So we like to work with our native soil if you have native soil. So if you're in a new home planting, your native topsoil has been scraped away, and you're really now back to like a subsoil that's probably not the most ideal for planting. So if you're digging a hole and it fills up with water, for example, it is still important for most of our plants that they have some well-draining soil, since as it does rain quite a bit in our area through the winter and spring, fall, winter, and spring, we don't want our plants to be sitting in a hole full of water. So making sure that it does drain. But again, our native plants are pretty happy with the nutrient level that's available to them in our native soil, with the soil chemistry. So the pH is slightly acidic, and the native plants that like to grow here prefer slightly acidic soil. So again, no need to change the pH or really fiddle with a lot of the inputs for your amendments in planting, unless you find again that you've got kind of hostile conditions, like I said, that standing water and that subsoil that's left by construction and contractors when they've scraped everything that was good off of the top. It is still critical to consider planting at ideal times of year when we're planting natives. So when it comes to putting them in early fall and into kind of late fall is a wonderful time for planting natives. And then late winter into early spring is probably the second ideal time for planting native plants. And usually you'll see a lot of native plant sales and kind of fairs and festivals going on at that time of year to promote great selection, great timing for putting them in. Now, although again, they're native and they should be able to tolerate, July in Oregon, it's still a hard time of year for a new young plant to get itself established. So although an adult or mature plant in the landscape is able to tolerate July or August in the Portland metro area, a new plant is just like a baby. We don't leave babies out in the summer all day long without special protection. So we have to consider, again, new plantings to be in need of our tending and protection for the first 2 and sometimes 3 years before we can really assume that they're more established and on their own. That means, establishment watering, just like you would other ornamental plants. They may not need as much or as frequent of watering, but again, getting those roots established so that they're able to fend for themselves. That also means that putting them in the first season, it's a good idea to give them a mulch layer to help reduce, water evaporation so that you don't end up with having to water too frequently, so you can keep that water in the soil. And it really is, after that third year, it would be wise to give your plantings supplemental watering, maybe every 2 or 3 weeks. A nice deep soaking through our hottest, driest months. So July, August, September would be probably the best times to do that. So, and as I mentioned, I would not, when planting native plants and working to create and establish habitat, we also have a slightly higher threshold, I guess, of acceptable kind of natural occurrences in our garden. So whether that's insect damage, small blemishes, or a few leaves that are spotty, again, it's more natural. And in many cases, it's better off to allow a few leaves to be blemished than to try to get out there and use a chemical control that may interfere even deeper in kind of that natural ecosystem that you're working so hard to create. So I'm not saying that you don't interfere if you have a disease or a major issue in your garden, but it's always one of those things to kind of weigh and consider. And I would not expect a native garden to be pristine as we might, an estate garden or, a garden that's more on display for that purpose. So I love to get inspiration from nature and see, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, so many different plant communities and really notice the different plants there. And one of the things that, of course, we see in Oregon is that at first glance, there's a lot of green. Our plants many of our plants have a similar shade of green even, that has to do with the kind of amount of iron, the availability of nutrients in our soil, and the soil chemistry that I mentioned is slightly acidic, at least in the Willamette Valley and towards the coast. So some of our plants tend to have a similar leaf color, but looking closer, you will see seasonal changes, variation, flowering or fruiting or seed pods that really help to start create that interest and beauty of one plant over another. It is easy for us here in Portland to find places to get inspiration nearby. Elk Rock Island is a native, kind of native area that you can find, well, Elk Rock Gardens, sorry, Bishop's Close at Elk Rock, that's what it's called. You'll find it in the handout, is a beautiful collection of garden that kind of is on a cliff over the Willamette River. So you see some native trees and then underplantings, the native madrones and their kind of friends. But really, Forest Park, head out towards the coast, up to Mount Hood. It's all around us. In the gorge, the wildflowers that begin to bloom this in spring give us really just kind of a charge and a reason to get out there and observe nature and its beauty. And so it should be kind of a second nature for us to want to bring that back and put those in our yards and in our homes. What I have here today on my table ranges from the common natives that many of us are very familiar with, to some slightly less common plants. And as I mentioned earlier, from hybrids of natives to what would be considered true natives. And I'll do my best to call that out as I showcase these various plants. So really, a trip out to the coast from Portland, some of the things that we'll see along the way would be, of course, in the underforest canopy, the dominant fern that we see is the western sword fern, which is a beautiful evergreen fern, grows in sun or even deep shade, gets to be fairly good sized, almost 3 by 3, quite drought tolerant. Once it's established, it grows underneath trees like vine maples and Douglas firs, and those trees tend to take a lot of the water that falls as in the form of rain. So the ferns we usually think of as being moisture loving, the sword fern particularly is quite drought tolerant. Another we see often in coastal communities is the salal plant. This is Gaultheria chalon. Salal is another lovely evergreen with these beautiful kind of shiny, leathery green leaves. It has already bloomed, I believe, with a pretty little pink kind of bell-shaped flower, and then salal will develop a purplish berry towards summer that is edible, but again, most of us are going to leave it for wildlife. Salal foliage is one that we often will cut. I like to cut and bring in and put with bouquets, so fresh cut flowers and things. Salal is a very nice greenery that goes along with it. And we see, although it is kind of that typical Oregon green, we do have these really cute kind of copper colored new leaves that are just coming out with its new growth for the season. So salal grows in either sun or shade. S-A-L-A-L. You'll see it on the handout. Either grows in sun or shade, and depending on whether it's in sun or shade, it will change its size. So it is more dense and compact in sun, and will be maybe 3 feet tall or so at the most. And in shade, it can open up and be 4, even up to 6 feet tall and wide. So, and a little bit looser in its habit. Still evergreen, but again, that varying conditions allows it to kind of have a wider range of spaces where it can grow. One that is just almost done blooming, but is an absolutely gorgeous native, and you see this lovely large flower, also very fragrant. This is a mock orange. So this is our Pacific mock orange. This is a variety that is a cultivar called Belle Etoile, but Philadelphus is the botanical name for the mock orange. This is a deciduous, large growing shrub that is late spring blooming, big white flowers, often again that kind of smell like an orange blossom. So wonderful fragrance. In front, also out towards our coastal community, Western bleeding heart. So lots of us love the springtime bleeding heart that we kind of know and love in traditional gardens and English gardens. But this is Dicentra formosa, has a kind of lower blue-green, ferny, feathery leaf. And then its blooms last much longer, continues to flower through the season. So a little pink cluster of not as like stylized heart-shaped, but of somewhat heart-shaped blossoms, and another flower stalk that's just coming up right now. So if you know your standard bleeding heart that you have in your garden, the ornamental type, it has flowered and is probably looking pretty shabby right now. The western bleeding heart continues to bloom through the summer and looks really great. Its foliage doesn't die back like the other one. Other communities that I adore, one of my favorites is the barberry plant group, the Mahonia or Oregon grape plant group, which has just been renamed barberry or berberis. So where most of us know the Oregon grape plant kind of category as Mahonia, it has recently been reclassified as a berberis, which gets me all in a fuddle, but I'm trying to relearn and say the right names. So we've got compact Oregon grape here, which is already flowered with its little yellow late winter, early spring blooms. And all of those yellow flowers are now ripening to a fruit that is known as the Oregon grape. The grape is going to turn kind of a powdery blue color as it ripens, and again, is very popular with birds. So the flower is visited by pollinators and hummingbirds. The berries are eaten by songbirds in general. And Oregon grape, which is an evergreen, has a little bit of a prickle on the edges of the leaf, not as harsh as a English holly or a holly, but it does have a little bit of a prickle, which helps to kind of create a nice dense thicket that creates spaces for songbirds to hop around in kind of safety. We also see coppery new growth on the edges of the Oregon grape here as well. So the brand new leaves coming out are these beautiful peaches and copper colors, and then those leaves will fade to green. And that's our compact. Also got a creeping Oregon grape and a Mahonia nervosa. So two more really cool varieties of Oregon grape, both also starting to show their pokey leaves and their little berry clusters. So these berries are starting to get their little powder blue and that precious new leaf with such pretty kind of blush colors. So low kind of ground cover or mat forming species basically of the Oregon grape, or taller, more hedge style types. You kind of can find the range of them. Now, Oregon grape grows in like dappled forest is its favorite space. It's dry, open slopes as well, so it's quite drought tolerant, and again, kind of a fun range of foliage color, flower times, berries as well. A lot of interest in with Oregon grape, and I wish that more people would plant it. That being said, over on this side, I have more of a drier, deciduous woodland and drier grassland collection of plants. So we've gone away from the coast over here with our salal and our ferns, our Oregon grape and our vine maples, and now we're over to some drier areas, and that would include the open woodland snowberry plant. So this is Symphocarpus albus. This is common snowberry, and it has a really kind of fun little leaf and kind of a scrambling habit. So the plant is a shrub 2 to 6 feet tall and wide, but where it does lay its little stems down, it can reroot. It's just now forming its flower clusters. The flowers are also bell-shaped, a favorite shape for hummingbirds and pollinators, tiny native bees. And then those flowers will develop into a pink or pale pink, almost white berry that's about the size of a pea, like a garden pea. Those berries are somewhat toxic to humans, but they're super edible for birds and wildlife. So lots of critters like to eat the berries. And the few berries that don't get eaten fall to the ground and make more snowberries. So snowberries give us that fruit usually by late fall, and often it hangs kind of on the plant into winter, so you get a lot of that winter interest in the snowberry as well. Next to the snowberry and making berries right now is twinberry. So twinberry is in the Lonicera genus, which is honeysuckle. So twinberry is a shrub form of honeysuckle, and you can see where it gets its common name because it's got little Siamese twin berries that hang down kind of at the undersides of their branches. And these berries have come off of a yellow kind of cup-shaped flower that was just blooming a couple of weeks earlier. And it's going to continue to create a few more flowers and more berries for the next month or so. And then as these berries ripen also, there's a seed cluster inside of them. So they're not the type of thing that we'll be eating, but birds love these berries. Squirrels eat the berries. All of our native wildlife will find this a delicious plant to visit. Honeysuckle tend to prefer full sun and be on like dry slopes, open woodlands. And this particular variety can get up to 6-8 feet tall, be kind of a vase-shaped shrub. It's not a vine as we think of most of our honeysuckle, so it won't be a vining plant. It does drop its leaves in the winter, and those little yellow flowers that start about April with these berries that give us kind of a second, ornamental phase right now. In front of my twinberry, not looking very exciting right now, but an incredibly important plant both in the Portland metro area as well as in our surrounding kind of wetlands. So not necessarily a dry plant, but open sun. This is Douglas spirea. So this is one of our native spireas that grows in on like stream banks, pond and lake edges, and floodplains and wet spaces. So here in Portland, we often see the Douglas spirea grown in our bioswales and our rain gardens, along with twig dogwood and sometimes our Oregon grape and a few other plants. So Douglas spirea in the spring has a large pink kind of feather duster looking flower that you see kind of in mass when it's in bloom. And then we've just kind of cut those flowers off, and at this time of year it's just kind of coming back with some nice leaves. It can and will spread by roots to create a thicket over time. So here we have another bit of the spirea plant coming up in the soil away from the roots of the main plant. And that's one of the ways that some of these native plants can spread, which means either you allow that thicket effect to grow over time, or you as a gardener need to get out there and sort of maintain, as I was mentioning earlier, the more individual plants so that you don't have just kind of a mass jungle over time that's impenetrable and maybe not super functional as a landscape. So a little bit of control over the ambitious plants is a good idea as well. Another that we are planting quite a bit of at this over the last several years has gotten more and more attention is milkweed. So this is our native milkweed. This is Asclepias speciosa. Showy milkweed is one of the common names to it. It of course has kind of a slightly fuzzy, long, sort of grayish green leaf. This is a fairly tall growing plant. It's going to end up at almost 4 feet tall. It will make a pink flower at the ends of the leaves, and it'll be blooming here soon. But the benefit to the flowers feed the monarch butterfly and other butterflies with nectar, but the actual importance of this plant is that the leaves themselves are a food source for the monarch butterfly's caterpillar. So when you plant showy milkweed or native milkweeds in your garden, the whole idea is that the plant gets eaten by caterpillars. Now, the plant and the caterpillar have kind of evolved together so that usually the caterpillar doesn't decimate and completely kill the plant, but it's going to have bite marks and the leaves are going to be chewed up and it's going to be eaten. So it won't be your prettiest plant in the garden. And it's not the plant that you go out and spray because caterpillars are eating it, because that's the whole point. So again, gardening with intent and remembering that what your purpose is when you see perhaps a leaf that's got damage on it. It's important to stop and remember what you're doing, and the primary reason that you are doing a habitat garden in the first place. So that's my little bit about milkweed. Kinnikinnick, Arctostaphylos uva ursi, one of my favorite botanical names. This is also known as bearberry. It is a ground cover for hot, dry slopes, and also goes into kind of just forest edges with our native fir trees or kind of vine maple communities. It is also like related to manzanita, in the same family basically as manzanita, and really just a lovely evergreen ground cover that produces, again, a flower that's attractive to pollinators and a berry later in the season that feeds our native songbirds. Then we get over to a hotter, drier habitat. So if you've got gorge type conditions, you live out towards Hood River or a little bit up onto the slopes in the gorge, we get into not necessarily alpine, but drier and higher elevations where there's not as much rain collection, where the pH of the soil perhaps is a little bit less acidic, and we see a different community of plants often that grow there. This is pussy toes. This is a little kind of native ground cover, very hard to see in detail the picture of, but many of us have been out in the wildflower season and seen the little pink pussy toes in bloom. And again, it looks like tiny little, like the little beans on cats' feet. So it's just a cute little flower that is endearing in many ways. And this would be full sun and on the dry side between waterings, and hardy down to like zone 3. So could be an alpine plant as well as on those kind of gorgy slopes. Another dry plant found in the Columbia Gorge, my understanding, by Mr. Lewis, or whatever, somebody probably on his team. This is Lewisia, so named after the Lewis of Lewis and Clark. Lewisia columbiana, I believe. No, cotyledon. And we have sunset series here. So anytime you see the plant name and then words that are enclosed in single quotations, so sunset series in single quotations, that indicates that this is a hybrid. So although there is a Lewisia columbiana, Lewisia cotyledon, both native Lewisias, this Lewisia is a hybrid species with kind of more focus on having these sunset colored flowers. Aren't they pretty? This is a succulent type plant, so real dry, very good drainage, grows on like rock outcroppings, and definitely if you plant it in your garden, you want to make sure that it's in a rockery or rock garden or with other succulents and treat it as such. Another beauty that is blooming right now, so popular with hummingbirds and bees and native pollinators. This is pollinators. This is one of our native penstemons. This is, I have to remember, it's the fine-toothed penstemon, also known as penstemon subserratus. It is another full sun, dry banks or kind of dry slope type plant, maybe almost 2.5 feet tall, not about the same width. Best in full sun, and again, drought tolerant, attracting native pollinators, as it mentions, bees, hummingbirds, butterflies, and it even makes a good cut flower. So what a beautiful color. We have more flower buds coming on the penstemon here. I was just on a little wildflower hunting trip this last weekend where I went out into the woods with some other plant nerd friends, and penstemon are one of the plants that I can't believe when I see them. They are in the place that I would think no plant could ever grow without somebody taking care of it. There was a beautiful, full bloom, vibrant purple clump of penstemon growing on a rock covered, like loose. You couldn't even climb up this little slope. It was like tiny rocks just loose, crumbling. And here was this gorgeous penstemon growing right out of the middle of the rocks. Nobody's watering it unless it rains or gets snow. It's on the eastern side of the Cascades, meaning that it didn't get even as much rain as we get here on this side of the mountains, and it was just blooming its little heart out. So the moment of perfection when you see those native plants in their prime space, doing what they do, is true bliss. And again, to be able to create that in your own home garden, I think is a worthy endeavor, but not necessarily an easy one. Takes preparation, takes, in many cases, multiple trips to garden centers. It's not, native plants aren't necessarily as common. I know that's ridiculously kind of, counterintuitive, but they are native, they're out there, but the growers aren't necessarily growing them for production to home gardens. We don't want to see a lot of wild collected native plants, because of course that would be taking them away from our native spaces. So whether that's, they need to have been collected from seed responsibly and grown for cultivation to be provided to home gardeners. And as I mentioned, these various resources, such as backyard habitat certification, which is funded, I believe, primarily by the Columbia Land Trust, Columbia River Land Trust. These organizations work to help promote nurseries that have native plants, the right times to plant plants, and when you can find them in the best availability. And often you'll see these plant sales at that time of year to help you get a hold of some plants that may be in short supply or just less common in the ornamental garden center businesses, so that you can find them. Other than big garden centers in our area or in your area, there are also, in many cases, more small specialty nurseries that focus on growing and providing native plants. So here, I'm in Lake Oswego, and I would be remiss if I did not mention Bosque del Natives, which is one of our favorite alternative resources. If we don't have the native plants that folks are looking for, we'll often happily send them on to Bosque del. So again, use your small specialty nurseries, use your plant community, use the resources that you have, use your imagination and create nature in your backyard. And I hope that you find it to be a very rewarding experience. As always, thanks for watching and happy gardening.